What's going on, everyone? So today we're talking about the biggest update we've had to competitive play in Star Wars Unlimited since the inception of competitive options and just in general the formats in, and that is, well, the title of the video: Boba Fett as a leader is officially banned from Premiere. They said suspended, but it's the same thing as for now, I suppose. They said suspended because perhaps they choose to revoke that suspension at a later date. But as far as competitive and casual premiere events, which is the normal format that most of your Star Wars Unlimited Friday nights and, of course, the planetary qualifiers will not be able to include Boba Fett because it is not legal in that format. There are a lot of implications for this, and we're going to talk about a few of them, some of the kind of skimming through their article here. This just got posted 11 minutes ago. They had a live stream about 3 hours ago where they talked a little bit about this, but this article literally is fresh, hot off the press. So let's talk about Boba Fett. Oh my goodness. So let's just walk through the article a little bit, and then I'll give you my thoughts on the whole thing, some pros, some cons, and everything that we need to know. Why take action now is the first step of this article. Basically, they go through and talk about how, my goodness, the meta is completely dominant from Boba Fett. Okay, more than 55% of winners, according to their statistic here, from planetary qualifiers, and 40% of top 8 finishes. You all saw my videos in the first couple of weeks of planetary qualifiers. Honestly, I stopped doing them and I focused more on set 3 because I just found it really kind of boring. It was kind of fun to talk about in the first couple of weeks to see if anything was going to shape up. And to be honest, nothing really did. It was just Boba Fett. And it was just consistently Boba Fett, more Boba Fett, more Boba Fett, more Boba Fett. And it got kind of boring to talk about because it wasn't just Boba Fett yellow. It wasn't just Boba Fett green. It was Boba Fett red and Boba Fett blue that was taking top 8 spots alongside, of course, all the meta options. So this is already something that is extremely alarming, as one leader is dominating such a massive portion of not only the full-on winners of planetary qualifiers, but also 40% of the top 8 spots. It's just not something that's really happening in other trading card games in terms of a healthy meta. So that was the first thing. They saw the results from their first competitive tournaments, and they're like, this doesn't really jive with what we want to see. They say, okay, if that's the case, is it really Boba Fett specifically, or is it something else? Well, they talk about how the cunning command villain archetypes plays many of the most powerful mid-range cards. To be honest, guys, it's Boba Fett. They said that they settled on Boba Fett leader as a clear choice because he was the most power level outlier, is what they say here. So basically, he's kind of the linchpin. And to be honest, it is Boba Fett, right? They mentioned cunning command villain, and that is true. The double yellow Boba and the Boba green are the most played versions of Boba Fett. But again, Boba Fett red was still up there. Boba Fett blue was still up there. And these don't include, I mean, they still have cunning villain, but they don't have that command portion of it. And they're not doubling up on cunning. They still have Fett's fire spray. I mean, they mentioned specifically Fett's fire spray and Boba Fett's armor as, well, options for Boba Fett specifically. It really was all around Boba Fett, right? All these decks were playing Boba Fett specific cards with Boba Fett as your leader, getting value from him and having an overstated unit. Okay, this is really, really something that pushed Boba Fett over the edge from set 1 to set 2. And again, they mentioned even here, all 4 base colors were represented among planetary qualifier top 8s. And the fact that Boba Fett was already a top archetype in set 1 before set 2 specific cards for Boba Fett, they mentioned Boba Fett is the issue. And I think this is a totally reasonable conclusion. And I think a lot of people, especially in my video, we spoke specifically about support cards like Boba Fett's armor and Fett's fire spray being a little bit of a problem, that not only is this leader potentially the strongest leader in the game, and that was my vote, from set 1, but he also got more specific synergy cards with him. Doesn't really make any sense to me, especially when no other leader really got things like that. So first off, they said, how do they, or not first off, but after that, they said, how did we get here? And they just straight up saying Boba Fett leader was a development mistake, right? If we knew back then what we knew now, we never would have let him go to print with that combination of abilities, stats, and deploy cost. Pretty crazy. They talk a little bit about how the high stats, some of the value of his abilities, something like around the Spark of Rebellion timeline of development and how they kind of just were at an uncertain time. And that's totally true. Totally true. It's super important that they really go through this playtesting process and really go ahead and try to figure out what exactly is kind of the broken aspect of some of these cards beforehand. But in some cases, there's going to be some that slip through. And they mentioned that some of the leaders that they were testing against had a different stat line, a little bit more buffed up than you might be used to. And so Boba Fett ended up being a little bit of a more average power level compared to some of these cards. And so, well, while they adjusted some of these other leaders seemingly more powerful, they didn't actually adjust Boba Fett alongside them. And because of that, they ended up with an extremely overstated leader in Boba Fett, whereas things like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader might not actually be that strong afterwards. So this is something that I think was just a big thing that slipped through the cracks. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Anyone who played the game from set one immediately saw Boba Fett and they're like, that's a lot of stats. That seems a little bit odd. Why is Boba Fett like a really early to deploy leader while also having a better stat line than some of the 6 and 7 to deploy leaders? Well, not quite 7 to deploy leaders, but 6 to deploy leaders. It didn't really make much sense, right? Coupled with the fact that you get to have one of the most powerful abilities and be in one of the most powerful archetypes, it just kind of added up and was a little bit odd. Now they say, okay, what about for future options? Well, in general, guess what? They're going to be looking at the metagame. They're going to be looking at playtesting. They're going to be looking at all these different things. They're going to be looking at, Sabine and ECL specifically, as they mentioned, certain cards that are really big meta contributors, right? Are they 12, 13, 14, 15% of the meta? Are they 20, 30, 40% of the meta? And perhaps we'll see things like an ECL band or Sabine Wren band, because she is kind of up there as a large chunk of the meta as well. Now, again, the difference between Boba Fett and Sabine is massive. I don't necessarily think that we'll see Sabine banned. I don't think it's nearly as oppressive as Boba Fett, but I mean, who knows? Going forward, they could make that decision. But one thing's important, and that is they have competitive events that they're going to base their decisions off of, because the planetary qualifiers and that entire system is now regular within the game. So what are the implications of this? What does this mean for the meta? What does this mean for certain archetypes? And what does this mean for certain cards? Well, if I were to just go ahead and pull up the card list here, and we look at a few cards, some of them are immediately going to get hit, right? Fett's Fire Spray, right? Card value for some of these cards, immediately going to be significantly worse. And honestly, this is a card that I don't even really play in any deck outside of Boba Fett. Maybe a leader like Jango Fett gets a little bit better, and you can still play Fett's Fire Spray because it works with Jango Fett as well. And, well, maybe you could get that synergy going. Boba Fett as a unit, right? This unit is going to be significantly weaker in the context of not being able to be played alongside Boba Fett and have that Boba Fett's Fire Spray / Boba Fett's armor synergies. Of course, Boba Fett's armor, I mean, this card is basically unplayable now. It is just a rare that's completely garbage for the most part, unless you're specifically playing the Boba Fett unit, or you're playing like Boba Fett as the new Boba Fett leader with yellow, but that's not usually something that you usually do. So a couple of these specific Boba Fett cards are going to be a lot weaker. But as I mentioned, what this also means is some things that you might have written off, including myself, because of Boba Fett, might get a little bit stronger, right? I mentioned Jango Fett. He's a 5 to deploy leader. He just has 1 less power than Boba Fett. But he does have specific synergies like things with Fett's Fire Spray, for example. Potentially, we could see Jango Fett as a leader because Boba Fett no longer exists in the meta at all. And that is something that's extremely important to recognize. What this also means is that a lot of decks that you might be looking at and had kind of competition, or decks that struggled against Boba Fett, well, suddenly they have a way easier pathway into the meta. For example, and this is not necessarily someone that's struggling, but if we look at Sabine Green, right? Suddenly, the biggest boogeyman for Sabine Green was oftentimes Boba Yellow and Boba Green. They no longer exist in the format. So we could see Sabine Wren run away with the format. It's possible. I don't necessarily think that she's that oppressive. I think that she is obviously an extremely powerful aggro leader and my pick for the strongest aggro leader, even including set 3. But that doesn't necessarily mean that she's unbeatable or unbeatable to the point like Boba Yellow or Boba Green, as we've already seen in several different other iterations of decks that are trying to beat Sabine Wren, right? So overall, there are some pros in that you're going to find that Boba Fett is not the most dominant deck in the format. The meta gets a massive shakeup for those of you that are interested in kind of trying different things. You're not going to be forced to kind of compete against this oppressive powerhouse with these decks that you're testing out, which is really, really kind of a nice thing, right? A meta shakeup is always nice, especially when it's literally 40% of the top 8 and 55% of the winners. Like, it's not like Boba Fett was an oddity and it's 20 to 25%. It was an oddity and it was 40 to 55%, around that area of how many people are playing it and how many decks ended up in the top spots. So it was like every deck you had to play or every deck you played, you had to beat Boba Fett. It wasn't like you could just kind of skip that matchup in other TCGs where, yes, I might have a bad matchup against maybe the best deck in the format, but I have a really good matchup against the next 3 best decks in the format. And it's only 10% versus a 9% of the meta. So it's not really that big of a difference. If you couldn't beat Boba Fett consistently, which you can't because Boba Fett was the best deck, well, you're just kind of screwed. And so that's really nice in terms of playtesting and getting to experience a lot of different things. The cons really come down to people investing into this deck and wanting to see Boba Fett as an option for competitive play. And they can no longer use the cards meant for that deck, and they can no longer go ahead and use Boba himself. Now, some people are going to be like, oh, boo-hoo, right? But it's not necessarily a good thing that leaders get banned, right? A banning means something went wrong, okay? That's what it means. They don't want to print a card that people can open up in their packs and be like, oh, I can't play this card because it's not legal, right? That's never a good thing. So at the end of the day, this was a mistake, and it is corrected, I suppose, which is something that a lot of people were calling for. And to me, I even mentioned in my video saying that if they suspend Boba or ban Boba, that definitely is an option, right? And I don't know if that's going to be a good thing or people are going to respond positively. But as far as I'm seeing right now, especially with the continuation of planetary qualifiers, guys, I think Boba Fett really did deserve a ban here from FFG. And I'm not surprised at all. And I think overall, this will be good for the meta. And for I for one, when I'm looking at some of these decks, especially like Asajj Yellow, for example, I mentioned that I thought it was potentially a different dynamic and better than Boba Yellow. I don't have to worry about that. And now I just think Double Yellow Asajj is an absurd deck, right? I just think it does really, really good. So the things like that where I'm like, oh man, this could compete against Boba Fett. Well, guess what? Maybe if it's able to compete against Boba Fett, it's going to be a top meta contender, right? Because of how ridiculous Boba Fett actually was. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. Guys, this is the biggest news we have ever gotten. So let me know what you think. Are you all for it? Are you a little bit annoyed because maybe you had, well, the cards set up for it and you were looking to dive in and still continue to play your Boba Fett? I am on the side that I think this is going to be good for the game and be more fun. As someone who likes to play set 3 decks and try them out, I think that they might have a better chance, but we'll see. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.